Hello, it's Tara Brabazon here, and it's my pleasure once more to be speaking with Steve Redhead, but it's something very special that we're talking about today, something very personal, but also very professional, and something that is born in Bathurst in New South Wales, but actually is shortly going to be released to the world. So it's my pleasure to talk with Steve about his new book for Routledge that's titled Football and Accelerated Culture, This Modern Sporting Life. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, everyone.
And it's so great to talk to you, darling. This book is in Routledge's Research in Sport, Culture and Society series. Could you tell me about that series and how your book fits within it?
Yes, I'm very excited.
Yeah.
More excited than usual. And now this book, which has been a long time in gestation, is now coming out in July in Routledge's Research in Sport, Culture Society series. And I am very excited about the series. And it's very interesting that in these days of series where you get really quite tight control by the academic editors, and I'm an academic editor at Bloomsbury in their Subcultural Style book series, and I've really, really enjoyed that. But this one is actually run by the commissioning editor that I'm working with at Routledge, Simon Whitmore, who's very good and very experienced commissioning editor. But I think it's interesting that there isn't attached to it, to the series, an academic editor or a series of academic editors. And I actually think that this has allowed some really interesting, diverse monographs and edited collections to come out, and they're very good, really high quality series, but very, very broad in the area of sport, culture and society, which is a really interesting area, and as we'll talk about in a minute, particularly physical cultural studies within that has become a really cutting edge label for work that is really interesting, and people in the past wouldn't necessarily have taken a lot of notice of some of the things in the monograph and edited book series. But actually this has got, for example, there's a new book that Ian Wellard's edited, which is called, which is actually on exploring movement cultures, which fits beautifully with our new postgraduate students who are staff at Charles Sturt University.
And a big shout out to Peter and to Daniel.
And to Dan. And they'll see when this book comes out in September, it's right on their work. You couldn't believe it. Edited collection, high quality, and there's lots of things in that series, going from topics like football in Asia, through Jamie Clelland's new book on sociology of global football, again really interesting for its sort of anti-homophobia, anti-racism stance. And I think there's some really, really good work, but the topics covered are massive. You know, drugs in sport, disability in sport, the sort of area that you're really interested in. Really high quality and really interesting, but they're not sort of tightly controlled. The quality is controlled, but not the area. And I think it's a really flourishing area. And because my book is it's deliberately designed as a kind of left field and indeed left intervention in these fields as a, pretty pithy monograph, and I hope it does have that effect. I think this series is beautiful for it. I'm really proud to be in it.
Now, you've raised a fascinating meta-argument there. I'm always quite interested in how digitisation has transformed publishing, and Routledge has taken some time to manage the transformations that have happened through, say, Elsevier or through Springer. And, Routledge, I think, has caught up with the digital publishing environment. Why I'm so fascinated about what you've said is, in the old days, which, of course, in digital land is about 5 years ago, in the old days, the academic editor used to be employed to push research into a particular direction. And what's incredibly interesting now is there's a recognition, well, it's a scholarly monograph. These books are actually selling again. And with this assumption that no one will buy a scholarly monograph. And of course, they're selling in huge quantities and they're being cut up. They're being aggregated to sell individual chapters digitally as well. Yeah. So they're making plenty of money, ebooks, platform management. So what's interesting is the diversity and the proliferation that is possible through both e-commerce and digitisation is promoting the monograph.
Yeah. So I would recommend to people around the world, look at this series. Go to Routledge Research in Sport and Culture series, Culture and Society series page, and you'd be amazed at the quality and the breadth of work.
Because there's so many new and emerging scholars out
Yes,
there. And
yes.
again, digitisation has allowed 1,000 flowers to
Very
to
much
bloom.
so. Yeah, it is that.
And the best publishers are grasping that really publishing has changed.
Yeah.
And they're working with the change rather than pulling
The
against it.
gatekeeping has stopped.
Or certainly been reduced. Certainly been reduced, and it's very powerful, and it's very exciting to be an academic
It's a new era.
working in this time. Now, we're talking about this new era and modernity and so forth, but actually there's a very interesting past-present relationship emerging in your subtitle for this book, which is This Modern Sporting Life. That's riffing off the past in the present in a really interesting way. Why did you commit to that subtitle?
Well, it's funny, Simon Whitmore, my editor at Routledge and Routledge board, actually turned the original title around. It's quite interesting that my working title for it was, in fact, a quote from David Storey, who wrote This Sporting Life in the 1960s, and the great black and white realist film was made from that book. Storey called his book This Sporting Life because he heard overheard a conversation on a train going back to Wakefield, which is where he was, which was basically, this sporting life is going to be the death of me. That's where This Sporting Life comes. And I thought, great, I love that statement. This sporting life is going to be the death of me. Wonderful title and a great theme for the book. And that's what I called it. And they said, in these days of digital, people are going to search for book titles, and we think that we have a bit of a different time. And the title they recommended, and I'm very happy to promote, is Football and Accelerated Culture, which is really what the book's about, and it's my concept of accelerated culture applied to all sorts of aspects of global football culture, and particularly my own research in it. And then they suggested a subtitle, This Modern Sporting Life, which I also love. I mean, that could have been the actual title.
And I love the idea, too, that the title could be the subtitle could be the title. Yeah. There's something also very interesting about that.
It's got that Baudrillardian reversibility about it.
Look, it has, and it also, of course, in terms of marketability and sellability, it's short, it's snappy. As I always try and do in my book titles, the argument is in the title.
Yes.
And you've done even better than this. The key concept is in the title.
Yes. I think they were very sensible in persuading me.
So that's terrific. And just a reminder to listeners, the title is Football and Accelerated Culture, This Modern Sporting Life. But let's dig a little bit deeper into that concept if we can. And we've already described this book as part of the Physical Cultural Studies project. Why are you inserting this book into this new paradigm, this new trope?
Yeah, as the Routledge's publicity of the book suggests, it ranges across a whole series of topics that's deliberately done like this, but also it ranges across a whole series of disciplines, and it's designed to be really interdisciplinary and cutting edge in that sense, and I hope I've pulled that off. But it covers everything in my work, really, from socio-legal studies, criminology, cultural studies, all the way through to what was called, certainly in the past when I worked at the University of Brighton, we had a research culture around this, sport and leisure cultures, and also media studies. So it's actually covering a whole range. The book is designed to cover a whole range of actual topics, but also to be interdisciplinary, hopefully in a new and cutting-edge way. But I think Routledge are publicising it in what they call physical cultural studies, and I think they're absolutely right to do that. Physical cultural studies has become a label for what used to be, say, the sociology of sport. Yeah. And that's actually quite right. And it's a label for a whole series of really interesting interventions. There's a Routledge Handbook of Physical Cultural Studies, which will come out next year. And there are tremendous interventions in that. Short interventions, but this is going to move that field, the field of what used to be called sociology of sport or leisure studies in the past, right into a new era. Really, really pleased that I'm part of that. And physical cultural studies is a very good description of this particular book.
And it really is dealing with the cutting-edge transformations and theorisations of capitalism as well.
Yes.
So the role of commodification in work, in leisure and recreation,
absolutely,
and the spaces we can create, we can cleave or we can remove from capitalism and leisure to think about recreation in new ways.
Yes.
And bodies and movement in really positive and optimistic ways.
Yes. I mean, it comes from, I suppose, about a decade of work where I wouldn't have called it physical cultural studies then, or probably would have done in the last couple of years, but it came from really using specific concepts like accelerated culture, which is in the title of the book, but I developed that in relation to the work of Paul Virilio 10 years ago and published work in that, and then on non-postmodernity, which I developed in relationship to Jean Baudrillard in a book about 6 years ago, and then really what we've actually talked about in other podcasts, the area of claustropolitan sociology, which is my kind of label for really post-cosmopolitan sociology, something after Ulrich Beck, John Urry, and so on. And I've applied those things to my own research into global football cultures. That's what it's about, and I think it fits physical cultural studies like a glove now.
Yeah, and that's brilliant. You've already talked about perhaps going into the new criminology or realist criminology.
Yes.
It's working off many titles. But I did want to, in the next question, explore the role of the hooligan, if you will, in your book. Your career, particularly your media presentations in the United Kingdom, were very much thinking about a particular version of masculinity in and for football.
Yes.
And the hooligan as a trope, as a folk devil, was part of that. And some of your early work, really in the last 10 years that you've been developing, has been creating new renderings of the hooligan.
Yep.
So how does the hooligan as a trope, as a folk devil, as a motif, operate in the new book?
Yeah, it is central to it in many ways, partly because I'm trying to develop with colleagues, particularly in the UK, in realist criminology, and indeed what they call ultra-realist criminology, a kind of new perspective on this, and not to get hung up around old ideas, which I think were mistaken, misplaced, which saw hooligans as resistant or part of political movements which would transform football and other cultures. And what I tried to do, and it's a long-term project, this, and there are reports from this long-term project throughout the book. What I did was actually looked at hooligan memoirs, and now in the archive that I've created, which is at Charles State University in Australia, there are 108 football hooligan memoirs, starting first in 1987, which is when I first started the archive. It's a long time ago. I was at Manchester Metropolitan University as a professor, but we were doing fanzine archives at the time, which was unique, and I started a little archive around football hooligan memoirs, partly because out of my criminology interests I was interested in the idea of redemption and, or you know, if you like, autoethnography and indeed oral history, which I think is what it is.
It is.
And the football hooligan memoirs range from really well written memoirs by journalists about football hooligan crews, old and new, but they mapped the contours of a particular sort of fandom and indeed a particular sort of criminality. And the oral history, which I think I've created out of these archive memoirs, is really interesting for all sorts of reasons, but it's particularly interesting for realist criminology and ultra-realist criminology. I think it's been recognised by those working in the field. And I think I've really been able to capture something that this is unique. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, I think, for all sorts of reasons, but I think it does correct the idealism that sometimes called left idealism in the past in criminology, which celebrated and romanticised violence and so-called resistance. I think I've been able to put this thing in its place. But I also used it in a way which allowed a kind of a new realist, kind of raw realist methodology, which I've called bunker anthropology in the past, which allows us to get better ethnographies of, say, football hooliganism in the future, because the archive can be used for that. Jeff Pearson, who's coming to speak at Charles Sturt University next month, which is great. We're thrilled to have Jeff here.
Speak to Jeff. Hi, Jeff.
His ethnography, which is actually an ethnography of English football fans, Blackpool, England and Manchester United, which actually took place over about 16 years, is a great example of how ethnographies can build on a particular aspect of fan culture. He wasn't looking specifically at hooligans, although tangentially he was. He was talking about a particular sort of fan that he calls carnival fans. But I think his is a great example, and there's some great examples, like Jeff's, of really good ethnographies. We need to go back to ethnography in this area. It fell away. People like Gary Armstrong are a beacon in this sort of area, so is Jeff. But ethnographies have been really good in other areas. I think they've been lost in sport, culture and society, and I'm trying to reintroduce them. I did ethnographies myself when I was younger.
So much younger than today.
But now what I can contribute is actually this archive, which helps to build a new ethnography when people start to do the ethnography.
And see, my argument isn't a lot of our students are using unobtrusive research methods.
Yes.
These series of hooligan memoirs provide the unobtrusive research methods because you've already got the data, you're just interpreting it.
Exactly.
So then that allows ethnographers to say, right, well, we've already got this body of knowledge. What is new? So we're not reinventing the wheel.
And huge historical knowledge. That's the thing. I mean, the hooligan gangs that I'm talking about, there are actually 400 referenced in these 108 hooligan memoirs and all the work I've done around it, all the interviews. I should say that a lot of this work is based on interviews that the research team and myself did over a number of years at a number of universities. And I should acknowledge that there's some fantastic raw data from the interview material and correspondence. You wouldn't believe the stuff. It's amazing.
And can I say a lot of colleagues and researchers have recognised the value of this research already.
Yes.
I think on academia.edu, how many hits has some of this early work
An early draft of one of the chapters called The Firm has now 12,500 hits on academia.edu, and it's put up as a draft late last year.
So if anybody's interested in measuring impact, have a think about that. Before I get to the final question, one of the areas I'm terribly interested in, Steve, is the nature of academics writing and when and where they write. Now, for me, this is fascinating. This is the next stage of your career. It's not the last stage. It is Redhead as a mature scholar and gentleman.
Yes.
That's right. But all I'm saying, Steve, is you've got this incredible body of research already. This is the next stage of that. But this bit of it has been written in Australia. And how do you think the positioning, as we've now been in Australia about 2.5 years on this iteration of our international journey through the Global Academy, but how has writing this book in Australia about European, North American, but non-Australian environments changed what you've written?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting where and when you write. I mean, this is my 16th book, and in some ways I've enjoyed it more than others. I mean, I think they're always really hard work, basically. But this I have enjoyed, partly because we have a beautiful house which we're actually sat in now, looking over the hills of New South Wales, and we live in, university town, and we have great privileges as a result of that. And most of it was done between offices in the office at work at Charles State University. And at home. But I also think I benefit from digitisation in a way that I didn't when I first came to Australia, where this was 15 years ago, and I did struggle more then because I'd had physical contact with researchers and people that I was writing with at the time, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when we lived in Western Australia in Perth, I thought, oh yeah, great, I'm really hooked up with everybody through email or whatever. But actually, this book was written very much by me doing the work and then perhaps sending it out to people and getting emails back from the UK or from North America, for example, from Europe, at the time that I was getting into work. They were going to bed and they were sending stuff, and I would actually pick it up when I got to work. And I'd work on things in the office, and then I'd come home and do some work. So actually I was working 24/7, but I've plugged into things which I'm so grateful for, people's comments and criticisms and so on, and they know who they are. A lot of people helped tremendously with this over the years. And I think also from our podcasts, that was one of the other things, that we're sitting here in New South Wales, basically recording these podcasts, but they're going to people all over the world almost instantly. And I got a lot of good feedback on things like my idea of claustropolitan sociology, which is really where I am applying those ideas, the ideas that I developed, to global football cultures. But for example, podcasts on claustropolitan sociology, claustropolitanism, non-postmodernity, accelerated culture and so on that we've done, I got a lot of good feedback from that, early ideas on that, over years, actually. Why teach Virilio to first years and whatever. I got feedback on stuff like that, and I put that into the book. So I've never felt isolated, even though I am sitting here in New South Wales.
Looking over the Blue Mountains. And the other thing I should remind you is you've used Twitter incredibly well. And for podcast listeners, if you would like to follow Steve, it's at Steve Redhead.
Yes.
At Steve Redhead. Now, also, in terms of your relationship with European and North American colleagues, you send a tweet out, or they tweet to you.
They've been fantastic.
So you wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, and the first thing you do is you go and check Twitter.
Yes, and I've had Twitter conversations of less than 140 characters at 5 a.m. in the morning, which actually did specifically go back into the book as I was writing. You're absolutely right.
And see, that's fantastic, and will render that normal rather than something that requires medication.
I did have medication at the time.
But it's been incredibly useful and instantaneous too.
Yes,
so
very important.
In the twilight, at the end of the British Day, at the start of the Australian Day, magic has been happening through Twitter.
Yeah, and it definitely helped me. Social media has helped me enormously with the writing of this book, partly because a lot of it is a reflection on social media and football culture. So it does. I mean, I called the Brazil World Cup of last year the first Twitter World Cup, and there's stuff on that in the book, and there's stuff on Wi-Fi at grounds in the book, and there's all kinds of things about what Virilio would call city of the instant, or future instant. The instant futures in the moment, and I think actually that has helped. Doing things in the instant have helped writing this book about the instant,
because it certainly provided its own momentum, if you like.
Astonishing, yeah. And I didn't realise it would.
And final question, and it is linked in with that digital discussion that we've been having, Steve. Who is the audience for this book? Who should read it? Who would gain from it? But also, who were you? Did you have an audience in mind while you were writing it?
I mean, I tell my students that they should have an audience in mind, and unfortunately I never put that into practice. I have no idea. And I've always thought, I've written 16 books, and I thought about 3.5 people would read them, which is probably about right.
And I think that's serious. There are hundreds of
But this time I think partly again through the use of social media, and I've used academia.edu, as I was saying before, for example, to put up drafts of my work over the years, perhaps the last 3 or 4 years, and got a lot of direct feedback. And I realised suddenly, and partly through the podcast where we're getting tens of thousands of downloads, that there is an international audience across disciplines for this sort of work that there wasn't before, because people are reading, this is high theory and raw realism. And that mixture, I think, absolutely hits a nerve. So I do think there'll be a bigger audience for this book, not just somebody who's interested in football studies or leisure studies or physical cultural studies. And I think the Theoretical Times Project, which we've done podcasts about and which is a book that's coming out next year, is about that too. It's about the fact that whatever people say about late capitalism, if you want to call it that, certainly the globalised version that we're now living with, that is also it's producing dumbed down things, but it's also producing a new intellectual culture globally, which is interested in that instant communication, but is also prepared to really work hard. I have a lot of very good PhD students who are working very hard and reading complex things, in real time with me. But actually, I think that's happening all over the world now in a way that we're not really tracking. Theoretical Times Project is about that, and picking out particular theorists who are actually dancing on the edge of that. But I think we've actually plugged into something that's not really understood yet, and therefore new audiences for new work I think will come, surprisingly. As I say, I've never really understood who my audience was, but I think I do understand it a bit more now.
I agree with you. And the other variable I would add, and it's been happening in the last couple of weeks, because you are indeed dancing on the edge of theory, and I really have a great sense for the first time in our lives as I look out at the Blue Mountains and the space in front of us, that we are creating new spaces of scholarship without apology. You and I are not apologising anymore for the work that we're doing. And the extraordinary thing about that, Steve, is not only are all these great books and articles emerging much easier than they used to in the old days, but also an amazing array of PhD students are coming to us.
Yes, they are.
And, in Australia at the moment in higher education, when all supposedly, it's so hard to get PhD students and blah, 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 we're getting approached almost on a daily basis about people that would like us to supervise, and they're from around the world, that they're coming and saying, we've heard this, we've read this, we've seen this, you are working in the area we're interested in.
Yes.
It happened in the car park yesterday as we left to go home. So there is a great sense about, book them and they will appear. Write the book and the audience will appear.
Yes. I think so. And I did want to intervene in these sorts of interdisciplinary debates, partly because I'd worked with PhD students in Australia, at Charles Sturt University in particular, but I'd also got a sense, as I say, that something moved. These are global shifts, I think. You can look at the UK election, which has just occurred, and people in the UK, my commiserations.
Yes. I don't think they've sobered up yet, don't
No, but actually there are shifts, there are political and economic and intellectual shifts which are going on, which are to do with the sort of things we're talking about today, about the way in which we haven't really we've started to capture some of these changes, but they're shifts that are they're tectonic.
They are, and they're about things as macro as the relationship between nation and race,
Yep.
and also as micro as how Englishness reinvents itself on a daily basis in and through Twitter, in and through Facebook. What does being English mean in space?
And sport and culture and physical culture studies are a really important part of that.
Steve, thank you so much for your time. This has been a special podcast. This book you've produced much easier than the other books I've seen as I've been living with you through your journey. There's something quite magical in this book, and I think brand new audiences and brand new people will come into our lives because of this great book. So congratulations, darling.
Thank you.